I'm Steve Wilkerson, and I'm with Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, Republican State Committee men and women were holding an annual meeting, really, in Orlando this past weekend, and they voted solidly against implementing so-called Common Core standards for education. Number one, why?
Well, a lot of them, there's a huge conservative backlash against these Common Core standards. And the argument that a lot of them were making, or is the same thing that's going on nationally, is that, that these standards are going to somehow nationalize education, inject too much of the federal government into the school system. And, there's arguments it's going to lead to socialism and, get in the kids' brains and so on.
There's some Republicans behind and supporting these standards, correct?
Well, and, former Governor Jeb Bush is perhaps one of the most outspoken people in the country on these Common Core standards. The standards were developed through a consortium of states and so on, and they're being implemented, pretty much across the country. But a lot of conservatives have really come out hard against it. But Jeb Bush is one of the leading education reformers in the country, and he's been very solidly supportive of it.
Well, to some extent, you might say they kind of resemble some of the standards in his A-plus plan for education and the whole idea of accountability.
Well, and that's his bottom line, is that, you got to hold kids accountable, you got to have standards. The other thing is that, by having sort of a nationwide set of standards, you can compare Florida against Iowa or Massachusetts or Colorado or wherever. It's not just a one state, look at things. You can actually look at kids, how they're doing in other places.
Well, what will Florida do if we don't have the Common Core standards? What will the what kind of standards will we have?
This is going to be a really difficult issue for Republicans in the next few months. Governor Scott has tried to sort of walk a tightrope on it. He got up in front of, on Saturday, after these committeemen and women took this vote, he got up in front of the annual meeting of the Republican Party and said, we are going to have Florida standards. But, that isn't necessarily saying they're not going to do Common Core. So he's tried to be very careful in the way he's dealt with this. The Education Department is looking at tweaking some of the standards, and they're also trying to develop actual tests. There's tests that need to be implemented to carry out the standards. It's all very complicated, but they're actually looking at finding a new test that would be more Florida oriented, if you would.
So it's a moving target, and something's got to happen fairly soon.
Yeah, and they're trying to implement this like next school year. I mean, this is some heavy sledding, and some senators last week, including Republican senators, are raising questions. Are we rushing into this? Is this going to be a mess? Basically, is what they were saying. And the Department of Education says that they're on target. They're going to be able to do this. But I think there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of scrutiny here in the next few months about it.
On another front, something of a surprise that's popped up is that Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater, who surprisingly, in some areas, who had thrown his hat into the ring to become president of Florida Atlantic University, wound up not making the cut, while another prominent political figure in Florida did. Talk about that.
Well, when Jeff Atwater, his name, surfaced that he was applying for this job, I think most people in Tallahassee and probably, in the state political establishment thought, if he's applying for it, he's got an inside line to that job. So we were all kind of surprised. Friday night, we find out that he didn't make the short list of 3. To be interviewed for the job. Former U.S. Senator George Lemieux did make it. George Lemieux is a former, he was sort of the brains behind Charlie Crist's gubernatorial campaign in 2006. Been very involved in politics for a long time. He's a lawyer, and not an academic, he's a lawyer. And so he made the short list. And I mean, it was a big surprise to a lot of people that Atwater didn't make it. The bottom line is Atwater is the chief financial officer of the state, and he's running for re-election this year. He doesn't have much opposition, and he's got a ton of money, so he's probably going to get reelected. But you know, just the sort of chain of events was very, very strange to watch.
Thank you, Jim. For more news about Florida politics and government, visit the Advances section of our website.